We'll have a little conversation up here for a second. I'm sure you guys will have some questions too, so at a certain point, I'll just jump down. You guys can raise your hands, and I'll hand you the microphone, and we can talk. So, first of all, again, thank you for being here. It's one thing to have a film. It's another thing to have a person who's intimately involved with the film based on one's book. My first question, I think, goes back to the genesis of the characters. I read a story where you were in Cape Fear, North Carolina, and you were writing a book on deep sea fishing. Can we take that down? Thank you. Is that better?
That's right, Matt. Can we kill that light? Is that possible?
Let's go noir.
How nice it was without that.
You look good.
Spot.
You look good.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason. So you were in Cape Fear, and you were writing a book on deep sea fishing, and you were in a bar, and heard the voices of Sailor and Lula. At which point you called your agent and said, "Give the money back for the deep sea fishing book. I'm going to do something completely different." And so that moment has now set off 25 years of stories about these characters. So I'm very interested to know what was it about those voices? What did you hear that set your mind running to write these
Well,
stories?
you almost got it right. It is true. I was writing about deep sea fishing. I was doing a series for the Atlantic, and I'd already done one on horse racing. And horse racing and deep sea fishing were passions of mine. So, I ran horses with a guy for a year, and a trainer, and then I've just been in New Zealand and various places doing this deep sea fishing. But anyway, yes, I was in Southport, North Carolina, staying in this, which is right on the Cape Fear River, and staying in this little hotel, the Riverside Hotel. It was really great. And I woke up one morning, actually in the motel or hotel, and I heard these voices of people talking. Sometimes it was people thought it's that I heard people in a room next door or something. I didn't. It was in my head. And it was Sailor and Lula talking to one another. And I just sat down at this little desk there and started writing their story. And I realized that I had something here. At least I felt it. And it is true then, I went and I called my agent and I said, tell the publisher, because I had already contracted with the publisher, with Atlantic Monthly, to do what I was writing as a book. And I said, tell him instead I'm writing a novel. And he said, well, what's the novel about? And I said, well, I'm not exactly sure, but it's sort of like a Romeo and Juliet in the Deep South type of story. And I didn't know anything else. And the publisher said no. They said, write that one next. And so I said, no, I'm writing it now. And I said, so give him the money back. And so my agent had apoplexy. He says, we can't give money back, give money back. I mean, that kind of thing. I said, don't worry, we're gonna make out okay. And it's a good thing I did. And we certainly did make out okay. But that's actually a true story. That's what happened.
That's amazing. And so that moment, I mean, I've read a lot of research. You just essentially said, well, I'm just going to do what my intuition tells me. Now we have this amazing.
A poet, a San Francisco poet who died in 1965, Jack Spicer, once said that really, when you come upon a thought or an image or, just a line that you have, you have to do it right that moment. You sit down, you have to write it. You have to do it right then because it's never going to come to you the same way again. And so as a writer, if this really is truly your calling, in this sense, and you feel it in this way, you have to do it. And I thought about that when Sailor and Lula came along. I said, no, I can't finish this one book and then, which is a totally different, type of book, and then think about this and go back to this. No, I got it right now. I got to do it now. And so I did. I gave back the money, which was a pretty sizable amount of money. And I knew I was going to get less as an advance to do Wild at Heart as it became. And, you know, it worked. It doesn't always work that way.
This time it did. So, at what point then did the possibility of it being adapted into a film come into it? Was it still in gestation? Had you had conversations with anyone? Where did it kind of start?
Well, Monty Montgomery, who was a producer of the film, was a collector of my work, and he was coming through San Francisco, where I live, on his way up to Seattle, where they were about to start filming a television show called Northwest Passage. And they were going to do the pilot and see what happened. And he asked me, "What are you working on now?" And I said, "Well, I just finished this novel, Wild at Heart, and I'm just adding the final touches and moving some things around and writing another chapter." And he said, "Well, can I read it?" And I said, "Well, I just have it in manuscript here. I don't even have the galley proofs yet." And he said, "Well, I won't show it to anybody." Or I said to him, "Don't show it to anybody, you know, but you can read it." Because he was a friend, you know. So the next thing I know, a few days later, I get a phone call, and it was David Lynch. And David said, "Barry, I read your novel, and I love it. It's great. And I want to make it into a movie." And he said, "Can you write the screenplay?" And I said, "Well, I can't write the screenplay right now because after I'm just finishing the last touches of this, and then I have to write the second book, Perdita Durango, because that character played by Isabella in the movie here, you know, it has taken over my brain. And so I have to write Perdita's story now, and that became the second novel in the series. And I said, "Why don't you write it? And, you know, then send it to me, and I'll tell you what I think and be the creative consultant rather than the co-writer or the writer of the screen." I said, "Well, when do you want to make this movie?" He says, "Right now. I want to make it right now." I said, "I thought you're shooting this thing," which became Twin Peaks, of course. And he said, "No, this is the time to do it. All the green lights are going off. You know, that's the way Dave talks." And so, you know, he did it. And he wrote the screenplay in 6 days, rested on the 7th, and sent me the screenplay, and I told him what I thought. And then later came the addition of the Wizard of Oz stuff, and he called me one day and he said, "Did Sailor and Lula ever get back together?" And I said, "Yes, of course, because the series is going on, you know, this and that." And he says, "Great." And he hung up, and then they added the happy ending where they get back together here. That wasn't not in the novel. The first novel ends when they separate, when Sailor walks away. And that's the end. So my ending and what became David's ending are both in this movie. So, you know, that it worked out okay. The funny thing I will tell you, though, is, so the first day of shooting, I'm on the set. I come to the set because David wanted me there. And he said, "Well, Barry," you know, after showing him the shooting script, he said, "What do you think of the script now?" And I said, "It's great, Dave, except you left out the most important line in the whole story." He said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "Where Lula says this world is really wild at heart and weird on top." So he picked up the script and he looked through it, and he said, "By golly, Barry, you're right."
And so as we know now, it's inserted in the second, third.
It's toward the end where they're in the Hotel Iguana, and you know, she's sick now, she's pregnant, and you know, but it was a brilliant stroke because in the novel it appears toward the beginning. It's almost like a thesis statement, if you will, and it gives you the energy and the direction, and we know we're going in and who these people are. And it works. It's perfectly placed there. But David was bright enough to put it at that juncture, you know, at the penultimate part of the movie, really. You know, where all this shit is happening, there's more shit about to come down. And so it was really exactly right.
So I'm interested.
That's called collaboration.
I was just
And,
about to
and,
ask.
and really, and to be open to that kind of thing, because, you know, here I am, somebody who for 30 years or whatever is alone in a room writing these novels, and I'm sure some of you are similar, and then you get to make movies, and all of a sudden you're with 100 people, and you have a social life. And all kinds of things go on, but the important thing is that you have to trust each other when you're, you know, collaborating in this way, and it can be a great thing. It's just a different thing.
So, there's so many different directions I want to go. So you're on the set, the script's going. What does it feel like? I mean, again, I'm thinking back to that first question when you heard those voices in your head. How does it feel then to see this, A, to kind of be creative through somebody else's vision, but B, to be coalesced in? You have Nick Cage and you have Laura Dern, and you have these people that are now inhabiting these characters, and they're in some cases saying different words, and the situations are somewhat different, but what is that like to go from something that's in your head to now it's out there in the world and other people are
Well, first it's on the page, and 80% of the dialogue in the film is in the novel. So, you know, that was fine. The big kick, really, is, you know, seeing these characters that you've created come alive and be enacted. And especially, if you're working with a director who has a vision, a very particular vision, you know, for me, even when I began writing screenplay, I'd already begun, but, you know, writing screenplays for a director, and I've written for a lot of really good directors, Coppola, Gus Van Sant, Lynch, you know, I've been very privileged in this regard. Some crazy Romanian director who was Lucian Georgescu, who was sort of the best of all. And you know, the thing about it is, when you know you're dealing with a visionary, you get more bang for your buck. You know what's going to happen. It's going to be elevated to another level. And that's certainly how I feel working with Dave. I mean, because he's going to make it and make it over and do something else with it. And that's what I'm looking for. Because, you know, the book is the book. It's never going to change. That's what it is. And then there's the movie. It's a different entity. It's a different form, you know. And to me, in some ways, it always has the most potential because it involves everything. Because you have the visual, and you have all the words, and you know, it's just a kind of a miracle if something good gets done. And every once in a while, that happens.
Which it seems like it did in this case. So I would love to. I'm assuming you guys have some questions, right? There's some hands out there. I'm going to pop down. I'll hand you the microphone. Ask away.
Hello. When you were doing the character of Adito Durango, did you know that you were going to do a book based on her when you were doing Waterheart? And second question, did you like that movie they did based on that?
Yeah, I was just suggesting to Ted that they show the film Perdita Durango here because it's due to legal problems, it was never properly distributed in the United States, but it sold the world and did very well. And it was the movie that was planned to make Javier Bardem a big star in America. And the cast included James Gandolfini and Rosie Perez and Screamin' Jay Hawkins. And it's a hoot, you know. I don't think it's a great film. It was made by Alex de la Iglesia, a Spanish director, and but it has great moments. I mean, and Javier is just absolutely wonderful. And then people eventually saw what a powerful and brilliant actor he is in the films that came out subsequently. But to answer your first question, no. I that sometimes when the character of Perdita Durango came into the story, I realized what a strong character she was. And she began to take over the book. So I had to suppress her story and rather than go into it all, she's actually less powerful in this movie than she is in the novel, and then in the subsequent novel, Perdita Durango. And so I realized she deserved her own book. So I was gonna have to go on, and that's what happened. And so I wrote that, and then that got made into a movie too. And, there we are. You have to stay true to your characters, is what I'm saying, And she was strong enough, powerful enough, and interesting enough to me that I wanted to find out really who she was and where she goes from here.
Right over here.
Hi, Barry.
Portsmouth.
Is there anything in the World of Art movie that you really dislike?
Well, the one thing, I think the one element that bothered me was how evil David chose to make Marietta, the mother. She's not that way in the novels. She goes all through the novels, or most of them. But I like a lot of the things he did with her. And Diane was terrific, and of course she's Laura Dern's mother, for those of you who don't know. So it was the first time that they had a chance to work together. And I think that was the one thing, but I love the scene where she smears her face with the lipstick, when that comes up. That was a real shock. One thing, but no, it was like a kick. I'll tell you this, when I hadn't seen the movie, I was in France doing promotion for the novel. And the novel was a bestseller in France, and this is before the Cannes Film Festival. And so, already Sailor and Lula were an item and well known there. And the novel, and then the film was called, Sailor et Lula. And in fact, 25 years later, this film has never stopped running in Paris. It's always been playing somewhere. Isn't that remarkable? And anyway, and certainly the movie then came along and was a great boost to the book all over the world. I mean, so it was beautiful in that way. And so I hadn't seen the film, and they were rushing the film to Cannes because we were in the competition. And they were doing the opticals in Paris and then bringing the film to Cannes, and nobody had seen the actual film. So at 2 o'clock in the morning, Monty, one of the producers, it says, come to the Palais, the Grand Palais, because we're going to screen it for ourselves just to see if it runs, if it works, and everything's in place and all that, because we were screening the next night, on the Saturday night or whatever it was, the Friday night. And so here we are in a 2,400 seat theater, and there's like 6 people, and Dave comes up to me and he says, Barry, after you see the movie, I want you to give me your reaction in one word, with one word. I said, okay. So anyway, here I'm expecting, of course I'd seen a lot of the dailies already, and I'd been on the set and that kind of thing. It wasn't like when we did Lost Highway, where I was there during the whole thing and sat next to David. Making a movie is tedious in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of downtime. In any case, unless you're being active and you're involved, then you don't really want to be there. But in any case, so I was expecting, this sort of explosion of a sort, and to come on. And I hadn't, of course, yet heard what Angela Badalamenti had done, for the score. So the movie starts, and there's the lighting, the fire. And then what music comes on but Richard Strauss? It was brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant with the Leipzig Orchestra. And it was so disarming to me that it was, and I realized this was going to work. This was beautiful. I mean, here I am talking about collaboration again, and the different people, all of whom have different parts in this. So Randy Tom with his brilliant, who's an Academy Award-winning sound editor, and and the way that was done. I mean, all of it came together in this way, and it was a shock. It was a shocking movie at the time. Those of you who were alive then, I remember. It was really a shocking film for people, audiences at the time. And that's that story. You know, I mean, it was really just remarkable to see it, and at 4:30 in the morning to walk outside and to have this resonate in my head. You know, I realized it was something special. I didn't expect that it was going to win the Palme d'Or. None of us did. Absolutely none of us did. So thank you, Bernardo Bertolucci, because he was the head of the jury. It was because of Bernardo that he got the prize.
All right, here's one.
Hi. I had a question about something you sort of alluded to earlier. I was curious about how exactly the Wizard of Oz stuff came into it. You suggested that maybe it was David's doing, and I was wondering how that came about.
No, it was David's doing. What happened was that when he first showed the film, it didn't have this. And Samuel Goldwyn Jr., who was the distributor of the film, didn't like the fact that it had an unhappy ending, as what he perceived as an unhappy ending, rather than, a realistic ending, let's put it that way. And that's when Dave called and said, did they get back together? And I said, yes, because I'm continuing on to write about them. And so then he came up with this idea of the Wizard of Oz, and mythicizing it in the sense, mythologizing it, I guess is a better word, but in the sense of Nick, being more like Elvis and, advertising as Elvis in Maryland, in the Land of Oz or some shit like that, whatever they were doing to promote the film. But that's how the Wizard of Oz thing came about, and that was his invention to justify it in a way, and there's a lot I like about it.
Hello again. I didn't get a chance to ask you this in the lobby, but when you made Lula a widow, I love the way you described her grief, because I've grieved before, and the way you made her describe how she had to go identify the body, and how she had to go through the funeral, and how she described the next couple of days without Sailor. How did that come when you decided to end Sailor's life?
Well, now you're giving something away for all the people who haven't read.
It's a book. It's been out for 20 years, so.
Well, yeah, I guess. I suppose, there's a question about when my friend Jim Harrison, who's a novelist and poet, really writes so well about women. He really has a great empathy and understanding. And this is very difficult, to do this, to inhabit another sensibility. And I suppose I was very, parental's not the right word. It was, I really cared so much for her. Lula is the star to me. Lula is the central character. Lula is the smart one. She goes through the 7 novels that she appears in as, she's really the person I listen to and trust and care about in that sense. Sailor's a lunkhead. I love Sailor. He is who he is. That's all fine. She loves him. He's a good person. It's a genuine true love story. How many of you out here have one? God bless you. Because it's pretty damn rare. And that's really what I wanted to create. That despite all of the difficulties, the troubles, all the shit that rains down on them and around them, nevertheless, they remain true to one another and survive. You know? And it's all based on trust.
Yeah, I have a question. You don't normally hear of too many screenwriters who are also poets. Has your poetry influenced your screenwriting or vice versa?
That's a great question. Because I began writing stories when I was a kid, but really I began as a poet. And what you learn there, of course, is economy of language. And then years later, when it took a long time for me to be able to write a sentence that I was happy with, that I was satisfied with. It took me a long time to write a sentence. And I didn't go to school, I'm not an academic, I'm basically an autodidact. And I learned by reading and talking to people and observing and that sort of thing. And when it came to my writing screenplays, I realized this is an entirely different language. The only thing that the writing of screenplays and the writing of fiction have in common is that they both necessitate the use of words. And it's a different language. And you're seeing it. You're showing something. You're not explaining it. For the most part, there are exceptions to every rule, of course, But there's no interior monologue unless you're Terry Malick. And, it's just, you can get away with anything in the right context. But the poetry it's good. It's a good way to describe it because, again, you're working with the economy of language. You want to get the message across in the shortest possible space because here we're making Wild at Heart and you have a contract that says it can't be any longer than 2 hours and 10 minutes. And believe me, with rare exceptions, can you get around that? Or you put it in the contract to begin with, or whatever it happens to be. So you have to be concise, and you have to do it right, and you have to find the language that suits the film, that suits the action. And so there is a valid comparison between the poetry and writing for the screen. Good question, thank you.
So you were able to use the word brilliant and shocking when you were talking about your reaction to the Cannes Film Festival, but were you able to give David Lynch a one-word answer to your reflection?
Was I able to what? I couldn't hear you.
Give a one-word reaction to.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Yeah.
So he said, well, Barry, what do you think? And I said, 2 words. I said, can I use 2 words? And he said, okay. And I said, not boring.
Did that make him happy?
I suppose. We're still buddies.
There's another question on this side over here. Back over here.
I really love the character of Papa Peru. I think he's like one of the best villains ever in cinema. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little about how you began constructing that character.
It's funny, Willem Dafoe said to me just recently, actually, last year, we were talking about this, and we're still good friends and doing stuff together. And he said, he says, I've made 100 films now, and the one character that people talk to me about, remember, and say is most memorable and was the best character I played was Bobby Peru in Wild at Heart. And here's the guy who was Jesus Christ. So at one point, and he asked me the same question. And he helped create that image false teeth, and you know, did that. And he, again, it's a collaboration. And of course, Willem is a consummate actor, a real professional, and really a good guy and a good person. There aren't so many in this business. And you want me to tell you the truth about this? I'll try to keep it short. I was with a friend of mine, and his father had died in Tampa, Florida. And he asked me to help him. He lives in San Francisco too, and I knew him. We were friends since we were 13 years old, and he asked me to help him drive his father's car with the belongings in it back across the country, you know, to San Francisco. And so I agreed, of course. And we were driving, and the car broke down. It broke down a couple of times. And then it broke down in Ozona, Texas, in West Texas, in the middle of nowhere. Some of you may have been there. And, you know, this was really a strange place. Big Tuna, Texas is based on our time in West Texas, in Ozona. And so we're stranded there. We were there for several days, you know, and never got the car out of there. I won't go into that story. But one night, we're sitting around outdoors, and there were several people there, you know, and they had a swimming pool there that was surrounded by barbed wire. They said, you know, to keep the coyotes out. And then, oh, this is an amazing place, man. And in any case, so a guy walks up and he introduces himself to me, and he says, Dennis Brazil, just like the country. And he was a bad motherfucker, this guy. And I said, okay, you know. And that's where Bobby Peru came from. So I didn't have to invent it. You know, you just have to remember these things. You know, and know when it's right, when it's true. And nobody could have done it better than Willem. He was into it. He loved Bobby Peru. And he can still do it.
All right, we have time for a few more. Any questions? Here we go.
Hi, you talked about being surprised by the film, watching it the first time. I wonder if there were some moments in the film that ended up being quite funny, but weren't exactly how you wrote it. And kind of with that in mind, when you're collaborating and something doesn't quite go the way you think it is going to go, how do you deal with those situations? Thank you.
Well, it depends. Deal with the situation. How much control do you have? I mean, you know, if you're not in control, you can't do anything about it. But I'm all for the humor. I mean, the Sailor and Lula novels are full of humor. You know, I mean, that's really an integral part. So I have no problem with that at all. You know, Lynch a couple of years ago released a set of DVDs called the Lime Green Box. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this. And in the Lime Green Box, there's a mystery disc. And it has an hour and 15 minutes of the outtakes of Wild at Heart. Because the film was much longer originally, and you have to cut it down to size. But he filmed everything in the novel, and it's all there now. It's on the mystery disc in the Lime Green Box. Almost like a second feature film. And there's great stuff in it. You know, I just wish, you know, we could have made a 3.5-hour movie, you know, whatever it was.
All right, last one.
I was just curious if there was a point when you heard the voices of Lula and Sailor that you realized that it could be expanded into many novels and just grow beyond those initial voices, if you ever remember that point and when that was.
Well, I mean, I knew I was going to write Perdita Durango, and then they were going to get back together, and so I wrote the first 6 right in a row. It was Sailor's Holiday, and Consuelo's Kiss, and Bad Day for the Leopard Man. Anyway, so they were all connected, and they were, you know, all published and all that. And I was finished. You know, I figured that was it. And like my friend over here, you know, said, Sailor does die at a certain point. And so, and then Lula is on her own. And it's the end of the first 6 novels or novellas. And then 15 years later, I began thinking about Lula again and wondering what was her life like after Sailor had passed. And so I sat down and I wrote another novel called The Imagination of the Heart, which was Lula writing her own story, like in a journal, but also at the same time she's having an adventure with her old friend Beanie Thorne. And they go on a road trip together to see their son, her son, Pace, who's living in New Orleans. She's living in North Carolina. Anyway, so I wrote that, and I figured that was definitely the end of it. You know, that was it. Sailor and Lula are both gone, that's the story. Then, about 3 years later, I began wondering about what happened to their son, Pace. He was the one unfinished piece of the puzzle. And after both of the parents were gone. So I wrote a novel that came out last year called The Up Down, which will be in paperback this fall. And the conceit at the heart of that is because he, in his own life, had not had what he perceived as a genuine true love story, and always admired his parents, even though his father, you know, done the stretches in prison, you know, had been for those 10 years in Huntsville, and one thing and another, and despite all their difficulties, and he's so impressed by them that after a series of circumstances that occur in his own life, he decides to sit down and write the Sailor and Lula novels. And so within the novel, he writes what I wrote. And so it's his story, and that's the last one, The Up Down, and I think that's it. I think I'm going to quit there while I'm here. And listen, thank you so much for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ted.
Those books are on sale out in the lobby, so should you feel compelled, they're right
Yeah, the
there.
whole thing is out.
Thank you, everyone.